He's a promise keeper, light in the darkness, my God, that is who. Oh, come on, that's our God we're singing about this morning. He's the way maker. He's a miracle worker, oh, a promise keeper. He's a light in the darkness. He's a way maker, miracle worker. He's a promise keeper, light in the darkness. My God, that is who you are. Waymaker, miracle worker, promise keeper, light in the darkness. My God, that is who you are. Sing it. That is who you are. That is who you are. We declare that is who you are. That is who you are. We sing it out. That is who you are. That is who you are. That is who you are. Just sing this out, Waymaker, miracle worker. You sing it, Waymaker, miracle worker, Waymaker, miracle. Oh, just keep singing that. We declare it, Waymaker, miracle worker. Sing it out. Waymaker, miracle worker, Waymaker, miracle. Come on, are there things in your lives you need to declare that over? He's making the way where there seems to be no way. He's the way maker. He's working on your behalf behind the scenes where you can't even see, but he's making the way for you. He's clearing the path for you in Jesus' name. Come on, let's sing it. And even when I can't see it, and even when I don't see it, you're working. You sing. And even when I don't feel it, you're working. You never stop. You never stop working. You never stop. You never stop working. Even when I don't see it, you're working. Even when I don't feel it, you're working. You never stop. You never stop working. You never stop. You never stop working. Come on, give it praise. Oh, we bless you, Jesus.
few years ago, you guys sent my family and I out to go plant a church in Denver, Colorado. And so as we began that journey, we had all of these hopes of what we were going to build and expectation of what we were going to see. And I'll be honest, we had a very compressed timeline of what we wanted to experience. In other words, we wanted to see God do something fast. And it wasn't fast. It wasn't even slow. And there came a time in the early months where I'll be honest, we didn't know what to do. We had done everything right. And right didn't seem to be working. And so we were praying one night. There was a group of us there at the house. And we're just kind of having this moment, and one of the ladies there, she says, "The Lord has shown me something." That can go really well. And that can not go so well. She says, "We need to have a Jericho March." I didn't want to have a Jericho March. It was my house. Those were my couches. That's my coffee table. I didn't want to march around my family room with the Jericho March. Now, some of you're going to be like, "I have no idea what that even is." I'll demonstrate. It's when the saints decide that something is keeping them from what God has. And so they just decide to kind of hop around in a circle. And you just kind of do this. Like, I don't know how many times, but you do it a lot. And you know, the folks that can't really skip, they're just marching. And it just kind of goes on. And I've been in a lot of Jericho marches, and I've never enjoyed one. Ever. I remember one time in the very, very early years of Family Worship Center, we're in the middle of praise and worship, and this guy walks up to the stage. And so Pastor Reggie goes down, and he's like, "What do you need?" And he tells him the same thing a lady told me in my family room. "I feel like the Lord's calling us to have a Jericho March." Now, Dad, being the man of great tact and patience that he is, he just kind of sends the guy off, goes back to his seat, then we finish, and he comes up and decides to tell us exactly what that guy thought, that we needed to have a Jericho March. And then he proceeds to say, "But we don't need to have a Jericho March." So I'm thinking, is this what I'm supposed to do? Do I just tell her no, like she's older than I am? And I mean, I know it's 2019, but it's not 1940, but just kind of verbally telling a lady like, "You don't know what you're talking about." I don't know, it felt bullyish. And so I didn't want to do that. And then I remembered what Pastor Reggie did in the end. We finished the song again, and the guy that asked for the Jericho March, he stands up and says, "Yay, I like it when you praise me. I like it when you have Jericho marches." So then Pastor Reggie says, "Sit down and shut up. That is not God." So then I'm like, okay, what if there's no win here. So we did the Jericho March. In my house, we did the Jericho March. And we're just marching. And I'm telling you, there has never been something done with less faith ever. Ever. And the frustrating part is, when you really think about it and distill it to the moment, like the Jericho March, the first one was pretty effective. When the people did something by faith, what they did actually worked. But for whatever reason in our generation, we have decided to just do what worked for someone else, but not do the thing that God has told us to do that will work for us. So if we could just take a little minute Let us go into the world's first Jericho March and let us see what's there. Hebrews chapter 11, beginning at verse 30. We're going to just read verse 30. It says, by faith, the walls of Jericho fell down after they had been encircled for 7 days. Now, obviously, the operative phrase here is by faith. They didn't just do what they did because they thought it would be a good idea. They didn't just do what they did because they had seen someone else do it. They did what they did because what they did was by faith. For something to be faith, it is going to look different than just a decision. Something that is by faith has principal parts that are what we would call faith. Hebrews chapter 11 and verse 1 says it like this. Now faith, it is the assurance of things hoped for, the conviction of things not seen. If you're a King James person, that is the substance of things hoped for and the evidence of things not seen. Two principal parts. It is always two principal parts. Faith is not just what you believe. Faith is not just what you do. Faith is what you believe that is matched by what you do. When it is faith, your doing will be inspired by your hearing. It won't just be done because you think it's a good idea. It will be done because you spent some time on the mountaintop and you heard direction from God. The direction that God gave you brought the substance, the assurance of what you were hoping for, which then encouraged you to do something that you had not been doing. Faith is always those two things. It is you believe God to do something that you can't do. You do the thing you can do that proves you believe God will do what he said he will do. And it's always that. And I don't care if we're talking about salvation. I don't care if we're just talking about living life in a general way. Faith is always two parts. You can't distill faith into another one-word answer. Faith is the one-word answer to the two things that we are told to do. We do something, we believe something. The only summary of that is faith. Faith is the summary. So we don't need synonyms, we just need faith. Faith is faith. What is faith? It is the assurance of what we hope for and the conviction of what we don't see. That's what it is. That's what it always is. And it was by faith that the walls fell down. So how do we come to this place where we actually experience faith, where we live it? There is a measure of faith that is innate. In other words, God gave us enough faith to begin our journey. Romans chapter 12 and verse 3 says it like this. The Apostle Paul says, "For by the grace given to me, I say to everyone among you, not to think of himself more highly than he ought to think, but to think with sober judgment, each according to the measure of faith that God has assigned." So in the beginning of your living, God assigned to you a measure of faith, and that measure of faith is enough to get you started. All of us have, every single one of us, to each has been given a measure of faith. There's not a group of elect that have been given faith and a group of non-elect that have not been given faith, so that the ones with the elect faith will make it and the ones without won't. To each has been given a measure of faith. And then it becomes the responsibility of us to take that faith that we have been given and then we nurture it. We continue following God in the faith that we have been given. That faith actually expands. It actually grows. But only if we obey it. Have you ever been in a conversation and someone said something and when they said it, it like woke something up in you? You see something and it just like it woke you up. I remember when I was a kid, just a little guy watching, movies or whatever, man. If I saw something that, like I was Batman when I was a kid. If I saw things, I was Batman. If I saw kids riding bikes and jumping ramps, I went and got my bike, built a ramp, and jumped a ramp. Like things would inspire me. What inspires your faith? When you see people living in such a way that is far beneath what you know God has for them, does that inspire something in you to help them? When you see somebody living in a way that you're just not there yet, that you just get around them and they just have a confidence, not arrogance, they just have a confidence that it's going to work. And you see that and it inspires in you something. What is that moment? That is a moment when you see God working and it inspires God in you. Let's back up to Romans chapter 10 and verse 12. It says it like this, or verse 17. So faith comes by hearing, and hearing through the word of Christ. This is going to be elementary for many of you, but I just want to make sure all of us are on the same page. That's how faith comes, by hearing and hearing the word of Christ. But let's put it in context. Back up to verse 12. He says, for there is neither Jew, there is no distinction between Jew or Greek. For the same Lord is the Lord of all, bestowing his riches on all who call upon his name. For everyone who calls upon the name of the Lord will be saved. Do you see all the everyones and alls? There is no distinction. So we're back to this idea, everyone has a measure of faith. There is no distinction. You, if you are in this room, if you are out of this room, you have faith. You have it. But has it been woken up? There is no distinction. For the Lord, the same Lord is the Lord of all. So we see this where everyone who calls upon the name of the Lord will be saved. But how will they call upon whom, and the one in whom they have not believed? And how will they believe in whom they have not heard? And how will they hear unless someone brings the gospel to them? And how will they bring the gospel unless they are sent? As it is written, how beautiful are the feet of those who bring good news. But then there's a question. But not all who hear have believed. As Isaiah says, Lord, who has believed what he heard? Verse 17, so faith comes by hearing, and hearing through the word of Christ. It's the beginning of faith to hear the gospel. It's the opportunity for faith. It just comes, but you have to believe it for it to be faith. It was spoken, you heard it, but did you believe it? When we hear things in the house of God, maybe this is just me, I project it onto other people. There are times I hear sermons that sound great, but I don't actually believe them. It sounded good, like it was exciting, but it just seemed maybe a little bit too naive. And so what did I do? I pushed it away. If there was faith in that sermon, I rejected the word that I heard. Even though there was the opportunity to have faith, faith came, but I didn't receive it. I pushed it off. So when we hear faith, the way for faith to grow is for us to receive the thing that we have heard. In other words, we believe it. Faith is the assurance of things hoped for. We believe this. And then what happens? And it is the conviction of things not seen. So all of a sudden, what I have heard, I believe. Because I believe it, now I begin to do something. When I do something because I have believed something, because the word of God was preached to me, that whole thing, that's faith. And it's nothing less. And it's nothing more. That's simply what faith is. So here we see that the walls of Jericho fell because they were encircled, but they weren't just encircled on a whim, they were encircled by faith. So how did faith come to Joshua? I'm going to bore some of you for a minute, but just please just lean in for a little bit. How did it come where Joshua experienced this thing that we called faith? Because it's not always just an overnight thing. If it begins with hearing, then there's a process to hearing. How did Joshua live through a process of hearing that he knew the voice of God so that he had faith to encircle walls? How did that happen? Let's back up a few hundred years before Joshua. We know Abraham, Isaac, Jacob. Jacob had 12 kids. The youngest of the 12 was, well, almost the youngest, was Joseph. And Joseph was hated by his brothers, and we know why he was hated by his brothers, because he was his dad's favorite. Dads, let me just say, please don't show favoritism because you'll get your kids killed. So, not actually killed, but they said he was killed. They put him in a pit, the brothers did, put Joseph in a pit, sold him off to slavery. So now we have Joseph who's taken out of his family and he's placed into slavery and finds his way down to Egypt. If Joseph is a story of anything, it's that God will make a way where there just seems to be no way. And some of you right now, you've had some experiences in life where someone else's decision has pulled you out of what felt like the will of God. Maybe it didn't work out the way that it was supposed to. Maybe you lost something that you should not have lost. Maybe something was taken away that should not have been taken away. I just want to tell you, just because that happened to you does not mean that God's will for your life is over. Because God will make a way where there seems to be no way. Maybe she's not there anymore. Maybe he's not there anymore. But I'll tell you who is still there, the one who promised to never leave you or forsake you. And I just promise you that God will make a way where there seems to be no way. So here Joseph is in the middle of slavery. He's now in jail, and God literally makes him the prince of Egypt. From slavery to the prince of Egypt. Now he finds himself leading this nation, creates this system of wealth. His brothers are in the promised land. His brothers are in the promise. They come down to the land that was not promised to them, and because of Joseph and his wisdom, they experience success in that land. So now they're not living in the promise, they're living in Egypt with Joseph. Joseph is 110 years old and he's about to die. And here's what he said to them. In Genesis chapter 50 and verse 24, it said, Joseph said to his brothers, I am about to die, but God will visit you and he will bring you up out of this land to the land that he swore to Abraham, to Isaac, and to Jacob. Joseph was living in uber wealth. He was living in a place of extreme success. And what did he say? This isn't the promise. Let's not get distracted by what's not the promise. Enjoy it, but let's not be distracted by it as if it's the promise. Joseph knew this isn't the land that was sworn to Abraham and to Isaac and to our father Jacob. This isn't the place where we are supposed to land. But all of a sudden, by a word from the Spirit of God, Joseph prophesied to his brothers. That's exactly what he did. He prophesied to his brothers and he said, God will visit you and he will bring you out of this land to the land. He was 110 years old. 100 years later, now we have this man born named Moses. Now, Moses' dad, Amram, had a dad named Kohath, had a dad named Levi. Levi was one of the brothers that heard Joseph's prophecy. Joseph prophesied to his brothers. One of the brothers was Levi. Levi had that prophecy in his belly. That was then spoken to his son, and it's one of the reasons why we see clearly at the beginning of the book of Hebrews chapter 11 where Moses' parents hid him by faith. Why? Because they had a prophecy. So now Moses is 40 years old. He's been raised in the wealth of Egypt. I'm almost there. He's 40 years old, been raised in the wealth of Egypt. All of a sudden, he's out in the field, and he sees one of his family members being abused by an Egyptian. And something, I've heard it called a holy discontent, something woke up something inside of him, and he realized the injustice is enough. We're not doing this anymore. And so on behalf of one of his brethren, he killed an Egyptian. And then he got scared. And at 40, he went off to the land of Midian. He got married, he had kids, he was herding sheep. Now he's 80. The promise was given 210 years earlier. He's 80. And he's out herding sheep, and he sees a bush that's burning in the distance. And he notices that it's not being consumed. And so we see this conversation begin in Exodus chapter 3 and verse 3. Moses said, I will turn aside and see this great sight, the bush, and why it is not burning. When the Lord saw that he turned aside, the Lord called him from the bush and said, Moses, Moses, and Moses said, here I am. How did Moses capture the attention of God? He turned aside from the thing that he was doing to see the thing that God was doing. Now, there's something for all of us. I had this moment yesterday. I don't know if you ever have moments where your kids kind of call you out on stuff. I tend to have a few. And we're eating over there at Fuzzy's Tacos, and just fantastic. You folks at Streams, that's on University for you. Those of you in this room, that is on South Florida for us. Fuzzy's Tacos. It's like a plug. They didn't pay me anything for the plug. I'm just saying they're great tacos. And so there we are at Fuzzy's Tacos, and I'm eating with my family. I'm surrounded by my family. Do you realize how many people would love to be surrounded by their family? Like, I'm in the middle. I'm at a table with my wife and my kids. Like, I am living in the riches of God. And I see this little thing on the TV that says Antonio Brown was released by the Raiders. And I'm thinking, what? What? So I pick up my phone, and now I'm going to ESPN. And now I'm looking at every single article I can possibly find on why in the world Antonio Brown was released by the Raiders. And here's the thing, I don't even care about the Raiders. Why do I care about the Raiders? I'm a Dallas Cowboys fan. We're going to win today, by the way. You heard it right here. Everybody in Denver just rolled their eyes. I wear my Dallas Cowboys socks every Sunday. There they are, right there. Yeah, go Bucks. There's not one Bucks jersey in this room. Who's got a Bucks jersey on? Like, not one. Not one. Opening day, not one. All right, so anyhow, I don't know if the Dallas Cowboys socks make me preach better or make them play better, but there's hope somewhere. All right, back to the sermon. So I leave the family and I look at everything that doesn't matter. It doesn't matter. It already happened. I saw that he was released. Why do I care? And we find, at least I find myself all the time being distracted from what God is doing because of something that someone else is doing. And when I find myself in that place, I'm no longer in connection with a move of God. Now I've been distracted from the move of God. And when Moses turned aside from what he was doing and looked at what God was doing, he captured the attention of God. And in that place, that's where God spoke to him. God isn't going to speak to us in the middle of our distraction. He's going to speak to us in the middle of giving him our attention. And that is extremely difficult for us to embrace in 2019 because we are surrounded by a great many distractions. Is it harder than it's ever been? I believe it is. But here's the thing, it doesn't matter. It just means we have to work a little harder because God still speaks. We still need to hear him, and it still requires us to turn aside from the distractions in order to hear him. So now he's in a place, he says, here I am. And then in verse 7, now it says, the Lord says to Moses, I have surely seen the affliction of my people in Egypt. And I have heard the cry because of their taskmasters. I know their suffering, and I have come down to deliver them from the Egyptians and to bring them up out of that land to the land that flows with milk and honey. Joseph said, God's going to visit you, and God is going to bring you up out of the land. Now God says to Moses, now I'm visiting you. I'm not going to visit you. I've come down. There is a moment that we keep saying is going to happen, and we need to pay attention when we're in it and it is happening, because there's something a little different when God is here, our posture and our behavior, than when we're looking to what God is going to do. We're in the middle of what God is doing. Are we embracing what God is doing in our homes? Are we embracing what God is doing in our nation? Are we embracing what God is doing in our church? Are we embracing it? God said, I have come down to deliver. So here now Moses has this message. Now he's 80 years old. He is 80 years old. And he goes back from Midian to Egypt to speak to the elders. And in this meeting where he's speaking to all the children of Israel, there is a 37-year-old Joshua who hears something that he hasn't heard before. And when that 37-year-old Joshua heard something that he didn't hear before, it woke up faith that was inside of him. And from that place, he was literally delivered. And by faith, with all the other children of Israel, he walked across the Red Sea. And why did he do that? He did it because he heard something. He didn't just go skipping across the Red Sea. He heard that God was delivering. So what did he do? He just followed God. And then there was a cloud. What did he do? He followed God. And a pillar by fire. He followed God. And when Moses said, we're going up to the mountain of God, and all the other people said, no, you go by yourself. We don't want any part of it. You just go do what you're doing. We will do whatever you say. What did Joshua do? He went up to the mountain of God with Moses. Why? Because Joshua was walking by faith. So then they find themselves to the Jordan River almost 3 years later. Now Joshua's almost 40. And he goes into the land that God promised them. And he has goosebumps. Like, this is the place. This is what God has given us. And he comes back, and that's his testimony. But everyone else said no. Now here's where things just fascinate me. God then prophesies. And he says, this entire generation will die in the wilderness. Every single one of them, except for Joshua and Caleb. Joshua said yes at 40. But because all the other people said no, he had to wait another 37 years before he could get the promise that God said was his, that he said he could take. Why? Sometimes scenarios and situations and surroundings, they just slow the process down. And some of you, you've been ready. And yes, God made the promise. But the rest of your household is just slow to the party. God promised you peace in your home. He promised you that. But that 8-year-old hadn't figured it out yet. He promised you peace in your household, but that 15-year-old hasn't figured it out yet. And we sit there and we get frustrated and angry, and the only thing that there is to do in those moments is just be faithful. Because the complaining isn't helping. Just want to let you know, the complaining is not helping. Faithfulness is required of us. In other words, there is something that we must do. If we are not doing it, we don't have faith. That's what faithfulness is. It's continually doing the thing that we do by faith. Without it, it's not faith. James chapter 2 and verse 20 said it like this. Do you want to be shown, O foolish person, that faith apart from works is useless? Was not Abraham, our father, justified by works when he offered up his son Isaac on the altar? So you see that faith was active along with his works, and faith was completed by his works. Some of us, there are just things that we have to just keep doing in order for our faith to be completed. And if we quit prematurely, then we don't get to the place that we should have gotten. If Joshua had have stopped 10 years after and just said, you know what, forget it. Forget it. I'm 50 years old. We're never going to the promised land. Forget it. He would have never had this moment where by faith he was circling the walls. He was faithful to do what God called him to do. And when he was faithful to do the thing that God called him to do, all of a sudden he found himself in position for this moment in Joshua 1:1. It said, the Lord said to Joshua. That was the first time that he had ever heard personally the word from God. The first time. He was 80 years old. He was always Joshua, the son of Nun. He was Joshua, Moses' assistant. He was Joshua subordinate. He was Joshua being faithful. He was Joshua persevering. He was Joshua walking by faith. He was Joshua singing the songs that the children of Israel were singing. He was Joshua walking the pathway that Moses said was the best path to walk. He was simply doing the things that he had been asked to do, faithfully following God. Some of us have been doing some things, but we haven't been doing all the things that God has asked us to do. And until we place ourselves in that position of subordination where we are obeying him and following him, we will never hear the thing we want to hear to tell us to encircle the walls that we want to encircle. And that's difficult. Like, that is a difficult idea to embrace, that our rebellion or our frustration or our uniqueness is actually keeping us from the will of God for our lives. Joshua was faithful to obey for 80 years. We think if we do what the boss says for 3 days, we're due a promotion. I did it. You did that. We get to school our freshman year. I did it. No, you got years to go, man. Like, years. Faithfulness is huge. It's not just, I commit to be in the house of God. You've done it twice. Great. Like, I hope your life is enriched. I hope when you step into this place, it's not just to check off a box because, oh, I did the thing that I was supposed to do. I hope you walk into this house with the expectation to experience God, that you want to feel his presence, that when this team gets up here and just begins to worship him, that you actually desire to lift your hands and your hearts and clap your hands and lift your voice and praise God, that you actually believe that wherever two have been gathered in the name of Jesus, that Jesus is actually there, that you actually would never withhold your praise from Jesus being in your midst, that you would never withhold your worship when you know the King of Kings and the Lord of Lords and the one who died for you and gave it all for you is in front of you. I hope that that's your desire, is to give him the glory due his name. And I hope that when the gospel is spoken, that your desire is for your faith to increase, that you can step out of this place and see God move on your behalf in ways that you haven't seen. See, for the first time, it said the word of the Lord came to Joshua. This is one of the biggest, I would say, mistakes of my life that I make in walking by faith. I have a need that will appear. And then I'll look for someone else who had an answer to the same need, and I'll just want to go copy what they did. I'm sidestepping the whole process of hearing from God. Do we realize not every blind man in the Gospels was healed the same way? So if the guy that was told to go wash in the river, he did that. If the next blind guy just went and washed in the river, he'd be mad at God for not healing him. And yet that's what we do all the time. We think because God did it for this one, then that's how he's going. All that means is what he did for one, he'll do for all, because he's no respecter of persons. But it doesn't mean he'll do it the same way. And we have turned faith into a need-based formula. If your need is this, then you go do whatever the person that had a similar need did that worked for them. What we miss is the process they went through, hearing what God told them to do, and the answer was found. They encircled the walls and the walls fell. Do we think their marching around actually caused the walls to fall? Like, it just needed enough steps around the wall to cause it to falter a little and it fell over. Do you think that marching actually made the walls fall down? No. It was just obedience. That's all it was. And this was something that the generation before them got wrong every single time. They complained about everything. Why did God tell them to march 7 days? I have an opinion. Would they complain? Would they complain? Because everything that the generation before them was asked to do by God, they complained. Every single thing. They went down to the Red Sea, and then there was no parting, and the army was coming, and what did they do? Well, you just led us down here to die. The Red Sea parts, they go across the Red Sea. God shows up in thunder and lightning. No, we don't want to do that. We don't want any part of that. Well, now Moses has taken 40 days on the mountain. Let's just make our own idol. These idiots did this all the time. They're starving. God gives them manna. I'm tired of eating manna. Like, you're not paying for it. It's free. It is sustaining you. Shoes don't run out. Soles don't fall off. Man, I really just want something new. Just really want something new. Don't we live like this? God gives us something and we want something else. God gives us our spouse, and well, I want my spouse to act like that. I want my spouse to have that. Really? I want my kids to be like their kids. I want my job to feel like that. I want just complain all the time. All the time. They complained all the time. Now God says march. And they marched. And they didn't complain. He said march again. They marched again. And they didn't complain. March again. They marched again. And they didn't complain. Proverbs 28:20, a faithful man will abound with blessings, but the person who wants to get rich quick will get into trouble. 7 days they marched, and then on the seventh day, now they got to go around 7 times. These are miles, multiple miles these trips are, and they're just going around, and they're going around, and they're going around, and they're going around, and they're not complaining. Why? Because anticipation is building in their heart, because God's about to do something. They're not doing this because somebody else did it. They're doing it because God told them to do it. When you do what God tells you to do, all of the sudden, there's an expectation in your heart. Now it's lap 2. It's not lap 2. God, why haven't you done it already? It's I'm another lap closer to the promise. It's not lap 3. Come on, God, 3 laps. Where are you at? What are you doing? It's one more lap closer to the promise. And we just keep on circling, being faithful. And then all of a sudden, when we have completed our faith by the thing that we've been asked to do, walls fall down. They fall down. Now, let me just end with a simple little thought. Jericho is not about bondage, and it's not about chains, and it's not about things keeping you in. It's really just the thing keeping you out. And sometimes we can sit there, just middle class America, no major addictions, no major issues, just not really seeing all God has for us, but, things are okay. But there's that thing that God is saying, if you would just obey me in, if you just obey me in, the insecurity would fall off. Like, if you would just obey me in this, it would fall away, the walls would fall, and you could step into my promise. For some people, it's just unforgiveness. Like, we just can't forgive them. And that unforgiveness is keeping us out of the promise. Maybe we were criticized when we grew up. Maybe insecurities were created because of the way that somebody treated us. But could we just look and pick up our eyes to heaven and understand that God has never mistreated us? That God has called us his child. Therefore, the insecurities that were created by someone else shouldn't be there now. And that God will give us things to do, and the thing that he gives us to do when we step in obedience in that place, the stuff that needs to fall off falls off. And when it falls off, there's a promise that is waiting for us. I know you have dreams in your heart. Some of you, you're just looking for version 2.0. You're looking for your second act. You're just ready to step into that next thing because you're kind of bored with the last thing. God has more for you. He has more for us when we step into this house. Look, I don't know if you've looked around, but it's pretty cool. But there are some true riches that we haven't seen yet. True riches that I remember Pastor Reggie prophesying to us decades ago. Where people would be lifting their hands in the presence of God, and there would just be the miraculous in front of us. Right? Like, that should create an expectation. I want to see it. Like I want to see it. Do you want to see it? Do you want to see God move in your household? Do you want to see God move in your church? Like I don't want cheap church. I don't like cheap church. Don't look at me like that. I'm allowed to say this. Just gimmicks. Everything's gimmicks. Everything's a half gospel. It's allowed. I can't say that. I'll offend somebody. Who cares? If you're offended by the gospel, then that's you. That's on you. Just cheap church. We have cheap churches everywhere. They're pathetic. I don't want to be that. And look, the prophet spoke against cheap churches, and the apostles spoke against cheap churches. And there was a church in Laodicea that Jesus said, look, you're neither hot nor cold. You're lukewarm, so I'm going to spit you out of your mouth. So I can say cheap church. I don't want to be cheap church. I want to be the church that Paul said was a glorious and a radiant church. The kind of church that Jesus said, I'm coming back for. I don't want the kind of house that's dysfunctional, where everybody hates each other, and when we separate, somebody goes and sits in a room with a computer and looks at a bunch of stuff they shouldn't look at because they don't want to go spend time with their spouse. I don't want that kind of a household. I don't want to have the kind of household where my kids look at me and say, I hate you because all you do is spend time on yourself. I want a new kind of lifestyle for all of us, that every single one of us, we go into a home that is exactly what God said it should be, that we step into church, and church is exactly what God said it would be, that the altars are full of people who say, I have decided to come and follow Jesus. And for those people who've already made that decision, there's still more for you, that we don't just stop at the altar, but we keep pushing further and further and further and further. Why? Because faith walks. Faith walks. Faith walks. Faith walks. We don't walk by sight. We walk by faith. If I'm walking, then I'm going somewhere different than I've ever been. If I'm walking, then I'm going somewhere new. And I'm telling you, God has something new for you. And there might be some walls that are keeping you from walking in. And if you walk around them, God will do the thing that you can't do because you're doing the thing that you can do. And when it happens, the walls fall and the promise is yours.